Stephen G Eoannou is the author of the award-winning short story collection Muscle Cars and the novel Rook. He holds an MFA from Queen's University of Charlotte and an MA from Miami University. And Stephen is with us here just now. How are you today?
I'm well. Thank you for having me today.
So, how did you actually get started as an author?
Well, growing up, I was always a big reader, and my sisters and dad, they were big readers as well. So I grew up around books and my dad's storytelling. It was probably about around 1981. I think I was a senior in high school, and John Irving came out with a novel called The Hotel New Hampshire, if you remember that one. And I finished reading that, and I was like 17 or 18. When I finished it, I remember thinking, I wish I could write a book like that. Yeah. And then a couple years later, I was at the University of Buffalo, and I took my first creative writing class. And at that moment, I said, I'm hooked. This is what I want to do. I'm sort of good at it. I want to really write for the rest of my life. So I finished my undergrad. I went to grad school at Miami of Ohio. And this was like the mid 80s. And about that time, folks like Bret Easton Ellis and Michael Chabon, all those guys who were just, like 4 or 5 years older than me were coming out with their first novels, and they're all around 30 years old. And I thought, well, that's going to be me. I'm in grad school. I'm going to write, my thesis. That's going to be my first novel. I'll be published by the time I'm 30. Well, 30 came and went, and 40 came and went, and I turned 50 and still no book. And it wasn't until I think I turned 52 that Muscle Cars, my short story collection, came out. So I'm an overnight success after about 40 years.
Yeah. And your short story Muscle Cars, as well as your novel Rook, have both garnered critical acclaim. What do you think the secret behind that critical success is?
I don't know. And I wish someone had told me about 30 years earlier, to be honest with you. I think I just plugged away, and I think the stories were very polished in Muscle Cars. All 17 had been published in literary journals before they were put in the collection. So they'd all been through, countless editing and polishing. And I just think that if you do anything for 30 or 40 years, sooner or later, you're going to get good at it, right?
Yeah.
And so something seemed to click right around that time frame. And, since then, that book came out, and then Rook came out last year, and now my second novel, Yesteryear, is coming out in October. So things finally fell into place with me for whatever reason. Maybe as a person I had to mature, certainly as a writer I had to mature at my craft. Things just seem to have gelled over the last 10 years.
Now, you mentioned your latest novel, Yesteryear, is forthcoming in October. What can you tell us about the book without spoiling it all?
Well, everyone's heard of the Lone Ranger, but they probably haven't heard of the man named Franz Stryker, who wrote and created the Lone Ranger. And they probably haven't heard about him because he sold the rights to the Ranger for $10, 10 American dollars, before the Lone Ranger, exploded into, pop culture phenomena.
Yeah.
And then the person he sold it to is a man who owned a radio station in Detroit, Michigan, and his name was George W. Trendle. And after the Ranger had become a success, had been on the radio for about 10 years, he started claiming in interviews and articles that he was the one who created the Lone Ranger. And there was even a story circulating that Franz Stryker didn't join the writing team until after the Ranger had been premiering on the radio. So his name has kind of gotten forgotten. There's still some controversy around who created the Lone Ranger. And I was drawn to the story because it turned out that Franz Stryker was from my hometown of Buffalo, New York. And not only was he from my hometown, he lived in my neighborhood, and he wrote The Lone Ranger, like 6 blocks from my house.
Wow.
So there was a connection there, being a Buffalo writer. And what I wanted to do is make the story a fun book. So it's part comic novel, it's part historical novel. There's some magical realism in there. It's populated with characters who lived during that time period. Jimmy Slattery, who was a former boxing champion. Franklin Roosevelt makes a cameo appearance. So wow. It's a lot of fun, I hope. And it's written in the same vein as like The Natural or Shoeless Joe or, those kind of fairy tale like like stories and surrounding the Lone Ranger.
Yeah, it's always fascinating when you find out something about the place where you live that you had no idea, but probably should have known.
Well, somebody told me, I think it was at a bar, and that the guy who wrote the Lone Ranger was from Buffalo. And I said, there's no way I would know about that. And of course, I immediately Googled it, and he was right. And that's what just really got me curious about Fran's life.
And because your Muscle Cars short story collection and the novel Rook have both been so successful with the critics, is there a bit of pressure for you with this book?
I think there's pressure with every book. I think there's some with this one because it is so different than Muscle Cars and Rook in terms of tone and language and style. It's really something different for me completely. And I can remember when I wrote maybe like the first 25 pages, I've got a trusted group of authors that we share work with. And I remember sending them the pages and saying, I don't need you to critique this. Just let me know if I should keep going because this is so different. And I was uncomfortable, having a great time, but it was uncharted territory for me. And everyone said, no, keep going. And I said, are you sure? Because I don't want to I'm getting old. I don't want to spend the next year and a half, 2 years if this type of approach with the language and the storytelling isn't working. And they said, no, just keep going. And so I did. And my mantra was, because it was I was thinking of The Natural and Shoeless Joe in the back of my mind, both baseball novels. My mantra became, swing for the fences, a baseball term, go for the home run. Don't hold anything back, so no joke could be, out of place. No sentence could be too long. Nothing can be too wild. What do you got to lose? So that was my mantra. Just go for it. Just swing for the fences. And hopefully it will be as well received as Rook and Muscle Cars have been.
And do you think that because you're in Buffalo and you know about Buffalo, you can put a lot of information in the book that maybe, if I wrote the book, I wouldn't know?
I think that absolutely helps. Buffalo has become kind of like the literary turf that I want to explore, like William Kennedy did with his Albany trilogy in the 80s and 90s. Like Stephen King does with Maine. Buffalo is kind of my turf that I've carved out. So not only are there Buffalo's stories and historical places and figures in this book, but my family's been here since the 1920s when they came from Greece. And so a lot of the stories in yesteryear are my dad's stories that he would tell growing up in Buffalo in the 1930s, living above my grandfather's restaurant. And the characters that would come into the restaurant, like the Jimmy Slatterys of the world, and the pickpockets and dog thieves, and all these characters that my dad loved and my mother hated. They all, I re-listened to those stories, and they have worked their way into yesteryear. So that was a lot of fun, incorporating the Buffalo stories with Fran Stryker's story and my own family history.
And your own personal history is quite impressive, because as I mentioned at the start, you've got an MFA from Queen's University of Charlotte and an MA from Miami University. How did your educational background influence your writing style and approach?
Well, I'll tell you, if I had a point, what made that pivot for me after, decades of not being published. I think I had 3 failed novels and a short story collection in the drawer that I couldn't place anywhere. I think if I had to point to one point that really made a difference is really when I went to Queens for my Master of Fine Arts. And it was really my last gasp as a writer. It's like, maybe this isn't such a good idea. So what I don't know what happened at Queens, if I was just surrounded by the right people and I found my tribe, if the things I've been hearing in creative writing classes for decades finally clicked home, or finally, if I had just lived enough that I had something to say and could say it better now. But really, it all happened at Queens. And I think one of the big things is I learned finally, what makes up a story. And it's basic stuff. It's like stuff we learned in English class, since 7th grade. You have to have a protagonist that wants something. You have to have, conflict and antagonist, growth, all those things that you learn in creative writing class that I've heard and read. For whatever reason, things clicked at Queens. And Muscle Cars is actually my master's thesis from there. I had started out with the idea of working on two of those three failed novels, and it was like, no, they really weren't working.
Yeah.
So I had to switch gears at the halfway point, and I switched from having a novel as my thesis to a short story collection, and that became Muscle Cars.
And do you think there have been any specific authors that have influenced your writing style throughout your career?
Well, I think certainly, like I mentioned, John Irving and William Kennedy. They certainly were early influences. I think Richard Russo, his sense of place has affected me greatly. And, my place is Buffalo, New York. So I think he influenced me a great deal as well. And then, I kind of go back to the kind of the noir writers of the 40s, like Raymond Chandler. Just those hard boiled detectives with their short, punchy sentences. I grew up reading those types of novels, Dashiell Hammett, and watching the movie versions, and I love radio. So even the radio teleplay version or radio play versions of those, I have recordings of. So I think that type of dialogue and short, punchy sentences really kind of made their way into my subconscious. And as I get older, I find myself writing more and more in that style.
Yeah. Well, this book is, of course, coming out in October, yesteryear. Do you have plans after that book for even more?
Well, it's funny. I wrote something during the pandemic, during the lockdown, and I call it my pandemic novel. It has nothing to do with the pandemic. But, I had a lot of writer friends and visual artists who just really could not create anything during that period, just because it was so awful and so scary, and that for whatever reason they just couldn't produce. I was sort of the opposite. I tell people that a lot of times we read to escape. I wrote to escape during that lockdown period. I mean, I was alone in a big house with a one-eyed dog, and I couldn't go out. And so I started writing, and I guess it goes back to my love of Dashiell Hammett and the hard-boiled novelists that came before me. I wrote a novel that's set in 1942. It's called After Pearl. The title comes from After Pearl Harbor, and it's about a alcoholic detective with a little one-eyed dog who wakes up after a 5-day bender, and he can't remember the last 5 days of his life, but he's missing 2 bullets from his gun, and the police want to talk to him. And so that's what starts the novel off, and he has to find what happened to the missing singer, and there's Nazis thrown in there. So I wrote that book for myself, as I said.
Yeah.
And I remember blogging saying, I don't know if this will ever see the light of day, if it'll be published, but this is really good and healthy for me to do this now.
Yeah.
So I showed to my friend, Carla Dameron, who has a wonderful book called The Orchid Tattoo that's out. And she's a crime and mystery novelist. And the first question she asked me, she goes, was this a series? And I said, no, it's just a standalone. I wrote it during the pandemic. And I showed it to Ashley Warlick, and her last novel was The Arrangement. And the first question she asked me was, is this a series? And I said, no, it's just a one-off. I wrote it during lockdown. And so I showed it to my publisher, and he goes, is this a series? Because I think Netflix would really like this. And I paused and I said, yes, it's absolutely a series. And I had no idea what books are going to follow after Pearl. But, when someone asks you a question like that and they throw out Netflix or HBO, you got to say yes, right?
Yeah.
So after Pearl is the first Nicholas Bishop detective novel that comes out in 2025. And I've just started on the second novel of that series. So hopefully that's going to keep me busy for the next few years.
Yes, very exciting. And this book, Yesteryear, comes out in October. Do we have to wait till then, or is it available to pre-order?
No, that's a great question. You can pre-order it now at any of the places you buy books online, or what I always tell people, you can go to your favorite indie bookstore, your neighborhood bookstore. They can pre-order it for you. It's available, worldwide distribution. So you can get that now. And Like you said, October 3rd is the official pub date, but you don't have to wait until then.
If somebody really wants to read one of your books right now, which one would you recommend?
Start at the beginning. Start with Muscle Cars, because that was really the turning point and the springboard for everything that's coming afterwards. So I would say that you can get a good feel for the sense of place in that novel, the types of characters. And I describe Muscle Cars as 17 short stories about guys making bad decisions. So that'll give you a good feel for my style, my sense of place, and the characters that I'm attracted to.
Excellent. Well, many thanks for talking to us today. It's been great to have you here on the show.
Oh, thank you so much.